They say that when a house goes quiet all of a sudden, something's not right. It was a cool, cloudy Thursday morning in Eugene, Oregon, May 12, 2005. The birds were chirping as usual, and commuters were just starting to head out on their daily routes. But for George Carson, this particular morning began with a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. George was 73 years old and lived just 5 blocks away from his son's 2-story home on Hawthorne Lane. His son, David Carson, had 2 children, Lucas, 11, and Emily, 8. George made it a point to visit almost every morning around 6:30, just in time to walk the kids to school and catch a quick cup of coffee with his daughter-in-law, Angela. It had become a ritual, one that brought him joy in his retirement. David worked late most nights, managing what was once a thriving family barbecue restaurant that had been in business since the late 70s. But in recent months, George had noticed something wasn't quite right. The family seemed tense. David looked more tired than usual. Angela wasn't her bubbly self. Still, George never pushed. He assumed they were just dealing with financial stress, the kind of burden that so many families were carrying post-recession. That morning, George stood on the porch, coffee thermos in one hand, his other hand resting on the faded brass doorbell. He pressed it once. Waited. No answer. He pressed it again. Still nothing. George glanced at the driveway. The family's white Lexus SUV was gone. That was strange. Angela never left this early, especially not without letting him know. And the kids? They hated being late for school. He knocked on the door, louder this time. Angela? It's me. George. Silence. Not even the sound of movement. No rustling, no morning cartoons on the TV, no dishes clinking in the kitchen. That's when the feelings set in, the unmistakable gut twist that every parent knows. The sense that something is off. Deeply off. George stepped back, fished into his coat pocket, and pulled out the spare key David had given him years ago. He inserted it into the lock, turned it, and slowly pushed open the door. It creaked in a way that immediately unsettled him. The house was dark. Still cold. George stepped inside, calling out softly again. Angela? David? Kids? Still nothing. What he saw next would stay with him for the rest of his life. The living room looked wrong. Toys scattered in places they never should be. A lamp knocked over. One of the dining chairs pushed far away from the table, as if someone had stumbled. The throw rug near the fireplace was crumpled in a heap, and a pair of small tennis shoes were lying at the foot of the stairs, mismatched. George moved slowly through the house, his footsteps careful. The kitchen was empty, but the coffee machine had been halfway prepped, the filter in but no grounds. Angela always brewed it first thing. There was a faint smell in the air, something metallic, something unnatural. In the hallway, the bathroom door was slightly ajar. George pushed it open. At first glance, everything seemed clean. But upon closer inspection, there were streaks. Damp patches along the tile grout. Discoloration around the edge of the bathtub. And one small, unmistakable red smear on the sink's porcelain edge. Blood. Panic rising in his chest, George did what he thought was logical. He called David's workplace. A young woman answered. "Mr. Carson hasn't come in yet," she said, sounding confused. He didn't call either. It was 7:12 a.m. George hung up the phone and dialed 911. By 8 a.m., Eugene police officers were at the house, securing the perimeter and photographing the interior. George sat outside on the porch, clutching his thermos, hands shaking. Inside, detectives began piecing together the scene. There were no signs of forced entry, but something was clearly wrong. The children's shared bedroom showed signs of a struggle, blankets on the floor, a bedside lamp shattered. On the rug, investigators found small puddles of urine. It's not uncommon, they said, in cases of sudden trauma or fear. In the bathroom, luminol revealed more blood. Whoever had been hurt had bled a lot. The sink, bathtub, and floor all tested positive. Someone had tried to clean it, poorly. The master bedroom looked ransacked. Angela's jewelry box was empty. A few drawers pulled open, contents tossed carelessly. The safe in David's closet was open. Empty. No fingerprints. No notes. No messages. No signs of where they'd gone. The Lexus SUV was missing, along with an estimated $300 in cash that David kept in a kitchen drawer. It was hardly enough to suggest the family had run away. If anything, it pointed to something much darker. That afternoon, police issued a statewide alert. Missing persons bulletins went out for David, Angela, Lucas, and Emily Carson. By 3 p.m., the media was already covering the story. Prominent Eugene family vanishes without a trace. One headline read. People began to speculate. Was it a home invasion gone wrong? Did David have enemies? Was it suicide? George answered those questions repeatedly. No, he said. My son would never hurt his kids. Never. He told the investigators about the recent stress, about how David had borrowed money to start a new clothing retail venture after the restaurant suffered losses. He owed over $60,000. But George had made it clear he was ready to help if things got out of hand. His voice cracked when he said it. If David needed money, he knew he could ask me. He wouldn't do this. Someone did this to them. Detectives considered the possibility. David's debts were real. His lenders weren't all traditional banks. Some were private, unregulated, dangerous. One name stood out. A known loan shark with ties to organized crime operating quietly in the Pacific Northwest. And yet, even in that world, killing an entire family, especially children, was seen as beyond the line. It raised more questions than it answered. By nightfall, the case had taken a grim, silent grip over the city of Eugene. Parents kept their kids home. Neighbors locked their doors early. The Carson house, once filled with laughter and morning chaos, now stood as a silent, horrifying question mark. What happened inside that house? Where were the Carsons? And who had taken everything away in just one night? To understand what happened that night in Eugene, you first have to understand the Carsons. By all appearances, they were the kind of family most people admired, well-dressed, polite, involved in their community. David Carson was 42 years old. A second-generation restaurant owner, he inherited Carson's barbecue shack from his father and had spent more than a decade trying to modernize it. He was tall, lean, always in a collared shirt even when grilling ribs. His laugh was deep and familiar, and he never missed a school recital or a little league game. Angela, his wife, was 39. She had a quiet elegance about her. A registered nurse who worked night shifts at the nearby hospital, she somehow managed to keep the household running with precision and warmth. Friends described her as the anchor of the Carson home, always patient, always prepared, always present. Then there were the kids. Lucas, 11, was in 5th grade. A little shy, more comfortable with books than sports, but always quick to help a classmate. Emily, just 8, had a sparkle to her that couldn't be missed. She loved to sing, often too loudly, sometimes off-key, but always with joy. She carried a pink unicorn backpack everywhere she went, even into the kitchen. She called it her emergency kit. But behind the smiles and PTA meetings, something was unraveling. David had always dreamed of doing more than running a smokehouse. He wanted to build something bigger, something digital. Inspired by trends and e-commerce buzzwords, he used a loan to launch an online clothing boutique called Red Pine Apparel. He targeted outdoor wear, flannel shirts, puffer vests, Oregon-style fashion. But what he didn't understand was the supply chain, or the marketing, or the inventory turnover. Within 2 years, Red Pine Apparel was hemorrhaging money. His small office downtown closed. The website crashed twice due to payment issues. Customer complaints stacked up. And behind closed doors, the stress crept into the family. Angela was supportive, at first. But when the restaurant started closing on weekdays to cut costs, and David took out 2 more loans, one from a bank, the other from a local private lender, with no paper trail, she grew anxious. Friends say she begged him to slow down, to sell the house, to get a second opinion. But David was stubborn. He believed it would turn around. He believed too much. By early 2005, the Carsons were in serious debt. The mortgage was 3 months behind. The Lexus had been refinanced. The last of their savings went into a bulk clothing shipment from overseas that never cleared customs. And the private loan, $60,000, due in 60 days, had now entered its final countdown. David didn't tell his kids. He tried to shield them from the late notices, the collectors, the whispered arguments. He'd tell George, his father, that everything was under control. But it wasn't. George, for his part, had offered help. Quietly, gently. He had savings. A retirement fund. 2 old properties he could liquidate. But David refused. "It's my mess," he said once. "I'll fix it." Angela, meanwhile, had picked up extra shifts. She even considered a second job, something on the weekends. She cut back on groceries, turned off cable, stopped taking Emily to piano lessons. She also started asking questions about the loan David wouldn't talk about. And then came the phone calls. From blocked numbers. Late at night. David would answer in the hallway, voice low, body tense. Angela asked who it was. He said wrong number. But she knew. She always knew. In the final weeks before the disappearance, neighbors noticed subtle changes. David looked thinner. He began walking with a limp after what he said was a kitchen accident. Angela had dark circles under her eyes and no longer stopped to chat after school pickup. The kids still played in the yard, but not for long. Something had changed. And then there were the strangers. 2 of them. Late teens or early 20s. Asian descent. They came by on 3 separate occasions in April and May, posing as delivery drivers, lost tourists, even college students conducting a survey. One neighbor remembered them clearly because of their poor English and the fact that they always seemed to be watching, not asking. Nobody thought much of it then. After all, it was Eugene, a college town. New faces came and went every semester. But in retrospect, those faces were the beginning of the end. On the night of May 11, 2005, the last time anyone heard from the Carsons, Angela texted her sister around 8:45 p.m. "I'll call you tomorrow. Too tired tonight. Long shift ahead." There was no call the next day. At 9:12 p.m., Emily sent a voice message to her best friend using her toy walkie-talkie system. A playful goodbye for the night. Unicorn base signing off. "Love ya, good dreams." It would be her last message. By 11 p.m., the house was dark. All lights off. Curtains closed. To any observer, it looked like a peaceful home tucked in for the night. But inside, something terrible was unfolding. When police investigators reconstructed the timeline later, it became clear that the family had been watched. Targeted. The killers had waited until David was out. He often worked late, closing shifts at a temporary pop-up stand he'd set up to salvage income. They entered when the house was at its most vulnerable, when Angela was likely bathing and the children were asleep. They didn't come to talk. They came to take. Later, when authorities recovered the family's bodies and began to piece together the horror, they would see the pattern. Controlled entry. Premeditation. Specific targeting of the wife first. The children, likely witnesses, eliminated. David, ambushed upon returning. None of it was random. And that's what made it worse. This wasn't a home invasion by accident. This was a plan. They were just a family trying to survive the American dream. They worked. They struggled. They tried to protect their kids. But in the end, what they couldn't protect them from was the evil watching from the outside, waiting for the perfect night. By the end of the first day, Eugene police had more questions than answers. There were no witnesses. No phone pings. No cameras on the residential street. No signs of forced entry. No known enemies. But what there was silence. And that silence weighed heavily. By the time the sun set on May 12th, the Carson family was officially considered missing under suspicious circumstances. The house was sealed off. The neighbors were questioned. Local media began airing coverage, showing photos of the smiling family of 4 and their missing white Lexus RX. Then, just before 6 p.m., a call came in from the Lane County Sheriff's Office. 2 workers at Dexter Reservoir, roughly 22 miles east of Eugene, had noticed something floating near the dam while operating a crane used for moving debris from the water's edge. At first, they thought it was a deer carcass or some trash. But something felt off. One of them pulled out binoculars. And then dropped them. It wasn't one object. It was 4. Floating, tangled together, partially surfacing. Within the hour, State police, divers, and a mobile forensics unit arrived on scene. The water was cold, still, and heartbreakingly clear. One by one, the bodies were recovered and placed on the muddy banks, draped with tarps. All four were weighted down with objects tied to their limbs, ankle weights, makeshift chains, even pieces of gym equipment. But the bindings had failed. Some weights had slipped loose. Others had been fastened too hastily. Whatever the perpetrators had hoped to keep hidden had come back to the surface. The first body identified was Emily Carson, 8 years old. She had been dressed in her pink unicorn pajamas, the same ones she wore almost every night. Her small hands were still clenched. Her face bore a dark bruise under the left eye and a faint rope mark around her neck. The autopsy would later confirm cause of death as asphyxiation. But more than that, the blow to her face had been devastating. The medical examiner said the force used was extreme, strong enough that, had it landed on an adult, it might have shattered bone. For a child, it had knocked her unconscious almost instantly. It was likely she never saw it coming. Lucas was next. 11 years old. He was found tangled near his sister, his pajama shirt torn, arms bruised at the biceps. His legs showed signs of being pinned down. Like Emily, he had also died from strangulation. But there was something more disturbing. The examiner found fingerprint-like impressions on his upper arms, suggesting someone had held him down while someone else applied pressure to his neck. There were at least 2 attackers. Maybe 3. And they hadn't spared him a moment of mercy. David Carson was third. He had suffered blunt force trauma to the head, likely from behind, as well as multiple bruises to the ribs and back. His arms had been bound with thick rope, which was still attached when his body surfaced. But strangely, none of his injuries were immediately fatal. His cause of death? Drowning. The official report was grim. David had still been alive when he was thrown into the reservoir. Bound, beaten, conscious, and left to sink. There were signs that he had struggled. Mud under his fingernails, a shoulder dislocated in a futile attempt to swim or break free. He had fought. He had died alone in the dark water. And then came Angela. Her body was recovered last, face down, deeper than the others. Her clothing had been removed. Bruises covered her thighs, arms, and abdomen. Her wrists bore marks from tight restraints. Her scalp had signs of trauma from repeated strikes with a blunt object. But what shocked even the most seasoned investigators was the sheer cruelty inflicted on her. There were at least 30 shallow cuts across her torso, consistent with a small blade, deliberate, methodical, and done while she was still alive. Her fingernails were cracked and bloodied, packed with foreign skin tissue. She had fought back. Fought with everything she had. For herself. For her children. But she, too, had been drowned, though, notably, the examiner believed it didn't happen in the reservoir. Her lungs contained no traces of algae or sediment typical of lake water. Instead, there were traces of chlorine and soap. Angela had likely been drowned in a bathtub before being transported. This wasn't just murder. It was torture. The forensic reports were chilling. Angela's body revealed DNA evidence of semen. Under her nails, investigators found skin fragments, belonging not to one person, but 3. The implications were horrifying. This wasn't a lone act of violence. It was a coordinated assault. The bindings on all 4 bodies included a mix of unusual materials, nylon straps, steel clips, and most notably, handcuffs and resistance bands typically found in adult novelty stores. Police began to piece together a timeline. The family was attacked at home, likely over the course of several hours. They were restrained, brutalized, and later loaded into their own vehicle and driven to Dexter Reservoir for disposal. There were no signs of struggle outside the house. No neighbors reported anything suspicious that night. It was as if the killers had moved through the shadows, silent, precise, unfeeling. By May 13th, the case was no longer missing persons. It was a mass murder. And the people of Eugene, especially the quiet neighborhood of Hawthorne Lane, were shaken to their core. Candlelight vigils were held. Flowers appeared on the Carsons' front porch. A GoFundMe campaign to support George Carson raised over $80,000 in under a week. But for detectives, grief had to wait. They had a quadruple homicide on their hands. And 4 reasons to make someone pay. There are cases where the crime scene speaks louder than any witness. And then there are cases like this one, where the silence says everything. Once the bodies of the Carson family were recovered, the Eugene Police Department shifted the investigation into overdrive. The evidence now pointed not just to a break-in, not just to a robbery gone wrong, but to a deliberate, calculated massacre. The forensic team returned to the Carson home with a new mission: to reconstruct what happened behind those walls. The first discovery came in the master bathroom. To the naked eye, it appeared clean, too clean. The tile was scrubbed, the sink gleamed unnaturally, and the air had a faint chemical sting. But under luminol, the bathroom lit up like a murder map. Blood traces lined the drain, the base of the tub, and the tiles beneath the bath mat. There were splatter patterns at shoulder height on the wall, and small handprints, believed to be Angela's, on the inner edge of the bathtub. The forensics team concluded what the autopsy had already hinted at: Angela Carson had been drowned right there, in her own bathroom. The killer had tried to erase the scene. But bleach doesn't erase trauma, it just conceals it. They didn't succeed. In the children's bedroom, things were more chaotic. Lucas and Emily shared a small space: bunk beds, stuffed animals, superhero posters, and hand-drawn art taped to the walls. There were signs of resistance: a broken nightlight on the floor, a kicked-over bookshelf, a trail of smeared footprints leading into the hallway. Police believed the children were attacked in their sleep, caught completely off guard. A forensic detail uncovered 2 significant biological clues: a pool of urine near Emily's bed, a small patch of saliva, likely from screaming or gasping, on the carpet near the doorway. These bodily responses pointed to sheer terror. And the fact that there were no signs of defensive wounds on either child suggested they were overpowered too quickly to react. It was no longer just a crime scene. It was a timeline of fear. Then came the basement. David had converted part of it into a home office, where he managed what remained of his struggling business. There were receipts scattered across the desk, a laptop open to a spreadsheet, a wall calendar filled with final due dates and red-circled amounts. And behind that calendar, hidden on a clipboard, was a handwritten list. Call Jonas again. $50K by June, or nursing shift schedule, don't interfere. And no kids involved, repeat that. Police speculated that Jonas might be an alias or contact related to the private loan David had taken. The note, hurried and half-erased, suggested that David had tried to negotiate, tried to draw a line. But whoever he was dealing with didn't care about lines. The house gave up more secrets. Under the living room rug, investigators found a fine layer of powder, soap dust mixed with blood. A UV scan showed drag marks across the hardwood floor, from the hallway to the garage. The path aligned almost perfectly with a trail of faint partial shoe prints. The garage floor had been washed down, but luminol revealed more blood there, too. The back bumper of the Lexus RX had faint smear patterns, indicating that the bodies had been loaded in, likely wrapped in sheets and weights. What stood out most were the types of materials used to restrain the victims. Angela had been bound with nylon straps and handcuffs. David had thick climbing rope tied around his wrists and ankles. The children, shockingly, had been bound with resistance bands, the kind found in fitness kits. But what disturbed police the most? The handcuffs and weights were not standard. They were highly specific. They came from a boutique adult novelty store less than 2 miles away, known for selling exotic restraint equipment. Only a handful of places in the Eugene area sold that kind of merchandise. Detectives paid the shop a visit. The owner, an older man named Vince, was cooperative. When shown photos of the bindings, he nodded instantly. "That's my stock," he said. "I only sold one of those handcuff sets this week. And those weights, only 1 kit left the store Tuesday night." He remembered the customer clearly. Asian. Maybe 19 or 20. Didn't speak English fluently. Bought the items in cash. Looked nervous, like it was his first time in the shop. Vince had asked a few casual questions, out of habit mostly. "First time using this kind of stuff?" The young man had just smiled awkwardly. Didn't say much. but his accent stood out. Korean? Chinese? He wasn't sure. But the pronunciation was off. Foreign. Vince handed over the store's security footage. It showed a grainy image of the man, wearing a hooded jacket, standing at the counter with a gym bag slung over his shoulder. That image became the key. Within 12 hours, the Eugene Police Department had the footage cleaned up and broadcasted across local news outlets. A person of interest was now publicly identified. They didn't have a name. Not yet. But someone out there did. By morning, the tip line lit up. A call came in from a student at a local language institute. She said the man in the footage looked just like another international student she knew, someone named Leo Wang. He had recently dropped out. Barely spoke English. And he had a reputation. He was weird, she said. Hung out with some bad people. Got into fights. Then he just disappeared. Investigators pulled enrollment records. Leo Wang. Age 19. Chinese national. Originally from Jilin province. Entered the U.S. on a student visa in 2003. Visa status, revoked 3 weeks prior due to non-attendance. That meant one thing. He was in the country illegally, and now missing. They searched his dorm. Empty. His belongings were gone. Roommate vanished. But inside a shoebox under the bed, they found a receipt. From the very same adult novelty store. Dated May 10th. It started with a name. Leo Wang. That was all the police had at first. A fuzzy surveillance image and a foreign-sounding name given by a language student who claimed to know him. But what followed would unravel a web far more disturbing than anyone expected. Leo Wang had entered the United States on a student visa in late 2003, sponsored by a private international language institute in Eugene. He was just 19 years old at the time, the only son of a construction business family from Changchun, in China's Jilin province. His family, not wealthy but not poor, had scraped together the funds to send him overseas in hopes of a better future. Except Leo wasn't interested in education. Within weeks of arriving, Leo had stopped attending classes. He preferred pool halls, online gambling rooms, and after-hours karaoke bars, especially those known to operate on the edge of legality. He got into fights with other Chinese students. He ignored warnings from instructors. And when his visa was officially revoked in late April, he didn't even contest it. He simply vanished. No one knew where he lived after that. Not even the school. But someone did. Police soon identified Leo's last known roommate, Ning Yang, another Chinese student, 20 years old. Unlike Leo, Ning had started out as a model student. He worked part-time at a burger chain. He kept to himself. His father was a mid-level municipal official back in China. Ning came to Oregon with modest dreams and a student loan. But Leo saw an opportunity. They had known each other back home, barely. But in a foreign land, even a shallow connection becomes comfort. And Leo knew how to manipulate. Slowly, Ning began skipping classes. He stopped showing up to work. He stayed out late, drank more, gambled more. By March of 2005, he was inseparable from Leo Wang. One classmate would later tell detectives. It was like watching a candle melt into the fire. Ning was quiet. Leo wasn't. But Leo knew how to pull people in. The deeper Ning fell, the more reckless they both became. They needed money. Lots of it. Leo was already thousands in debt from gambling. Ning, ashamed to tell his family, started borrowing from other students. Then stealing. Small things at first, wallets left in the dorm, phones unattended at the library. But petty theft couldn't sustain their habits. That's when they met Wei Wei. Wei Wei was different. At 24, he was older than most of the other Chinese students. A former soldier who had served 2 years in China's provincial military police, he had the posture and calmness of someone used to giving orders. His family owned a medium-sized electronics factory in Hunan province. He came to the U.S. not to escape, but to prove himself. For the first year, he did just that. His grades were average but consistent. He spoke little but was respectful. He didn't drink, didn't party, didn't chase women. But in early 2005, everything changed. The factory back home hit financial trouble. His family stopped sending money. He was forced to leave the dorms and took part-time janitorial work to survive. Teachers noticed he began skipping class, sometimes for days. When asked, he cited headaches, work stress, or simply didn't respond. Then one day, Leo and Ning showed up at his door. They weren't friends, not really, but they were countrymen. And in foreign cities, that sometimes means more than shared interests. They took Wei out for drinks, paid for his meals, gave him tips on how to survive America. And then, they offered him a job. Not a legal one. A break-in. Just one. No one home. Some cash, maybe jewelry. Enough to get through the month. Wei refused at first. But hunger has a voice. And pride can be silenced. When he finally agreed, it was for what they promised would be a victimless theft. It wasn't. The first job was a teacher's apartment. They waited until she was at work. They broke in, took about $400 in cash, a few electronics. No one got hurt. But that was the gateway. Over the next 3 weeks, the trio hit at least 4 other student dorms, 2 storage units, and 1 private residence belonging to another Chinese student who'd just flown home for vacation. They weren't caught. They felt invincible. Then Leo started talking bigger. He wanted to go after Americans. Because, as he said, they don't watch their money. And they never fight back. Wei was nervous. Ning wasn't. The 2 younger men started scouting neighborhoods. They didn't know much about the city's upper-class zones, so they improvised. Their logic was simple. Find the houses with luxury cars, expensive fences, and American flags. The Carsons fit that profile. They lived in a 2-story colonial-style home. Had a white Lexus RX. A spacious lawn. The Support Our Troops decal on the mailbox. To the 3 outsiders, it looked like wealth, success, and, more importantly, money inside. They watched for a week. They noted that the father often came home late. The mother worked nights but had days off. The kids left for school around 7:30 a.m. and got home by 3. Their plan was simple. Wait until David was away. Enter through the back. Restrain Angela. Take what they could. They had no intention of leaving witnesses. Wei would later confess this part with bitterness in his voice. He claimed he didn't know they were going to kill. He said he thought it was just a robbery. That he'd been pressured. That he tried to back out. But when asked why he helped buy the restraints, or why he helped drag 4 bodies into a vehicle, he had no answer. Just silence. Sometimes evil creeps in slowly, through desperation, loneliness, or hunger. But sometimes, it comes in the form of a smiling friend, holding out a hand and saying, "Don't worry. It'll be easy." That's how it starts. But it never ends that way. It was supposed to be just another night. For the Carson family, May 11, 2005, began like any other weekday. David closed up the pop-up barbecue tent around 9:30 p.m. Angela had worked an early hospital shift and stayed home with the kids. Lucas had finished a math worksheet. Emily was drawing a rainbow on the kitchen chalkboard. The TV played quietly in the background. Microwave popcorn was still warm in its bag. The house smelled faintly of shampoo, crayons, and lavender detergent, familiar, comforting. But outside, down the block, in the shadows of the trees, a Lexus SUV slowly rolled past, then circled back. Inside were 3 young men. Leo Wang was behind the wheel, gloves already on. Ning Yang sat in the passenger seat, his face calm, almost detached. Wei in the back seat, clutched a drawstring bag, the one with duct tape, plastic ties, handcuffs, 2 folding knives, and a thin rope looped neatly like a belt. They had watched the house for days. They knew David would be out late. They knew Angela was home with the children. They thought they were ready. They weren't. At approximately 10:20 p.m., they parked the car 2 streets over and approached the Carson house from the back alley. They wore black hoodies and surgical gloves. One carried a crowbar. Another had a kitchen knife duct taped to his forearm. The back window of the laundry room was unlocked. That's where they entered. Lucas and Emily were already asleep in their room. Angela was in the shower. The running water masked the sound of the window creaking open. Of feet landing on the tiled floor. Of breath held in darkness. They split up. Leo crept down the hallway. Ning guarded the kids' room. Wei hovered near the bathroom door, bag in hand. The next few minutes happened fast. Too fast for anyone to escape, too slow for anyone to forget. Angela stepped out of the shower, wrapped in a towel. As she reached for her robe, she saw a movement in the fogged mirror behind her. She turned and froze. A stranger stood in the doorway. Asian. Face tense. He said nothing. Angela screamed. She grabbed a bottle of shampoo and threw it, but missed. She lunged for the sink but was tackled hard, shoulder first, into the tiles. Her towel fell. She hit the floor, hands flailing. The assailant pulled a zip tie tight around one wrist. She fought. That's when Wei entered. They struggled with her together, dragging her out of the bathroom, leaving a trail of wet footprints and streaks of blood from a gash on her leg. By the time they bound her hands, Angela's mouth was bleeding. She was still conscious, eyes wide, breathing in short, ragged bursts. They carried her to the master bedroom. What happened next would later be described in testimony as methodical cruelty. Angela was raped, beaten, cut, repeatedly, with a small folding blade. Shallow, painful incisions. Some meant to punish, others, just to assert control. Throughout it all, she didn't stop resisting. The skin flakes found under her fingernails would later prove she fought to the end, scratching, clawing, tearing at her attackers. It took nearly 20 minutes for them to subdue her completely. And then they filled the bathtub, pushed her in, held her down. She drowned not in silence but in defiance. Meanwhile, in the children's room, Lucas had woken up. He heard something. He stepped into the hallway and saw a man he didn't recognize. "Mom!" The man turned. Lucas ran. He made it to the stairs, but didn't get far. Ning tackled him, picked him up by the shoulders. Lucas kicked, screamed, bit his arm. That's when Leo came in. They dragged Lucas back to the room, where Emily had now woken up, crying. "Where's Mommy?" No answer. Just rope. Lucas was restrained, legs pinned down by Ning's knees. A rope looped around his neck. It didn't take long. His body spasmed once, twice, then stopped. Emily was next. She screamed for her mother. She was hit hard. Twice. She stopped screaming. By the time David returned home at 11:37 p.m., the house was eerily quiet. He parked the car, opened the front door, and saw nothing out of place. Until he stepped into the hallway. That's when they ambushed him. All three. Leo struck first, a blow to the back of the head with a metal bar. David collapsed to one knee. Wei tackled him. Ning looped the rope around his neck. David was strong. He nearly broke free. But 3 against 1. It didn't take long. They beat him until he stopped moving. Then they bound his arms, his legs, taped his mouth. He was still breathing. And they knew it. By midnight, the house was a graveyard. For bodies, lifeless, bound, some bloodied, others bruised, were wrapped in sheets and carried out one by one. Angela was loaded first. Then Emily, Lucas, and finally David. The attackers moved quickly, wiping down handles, light switches, even door frames. They poured bleach down the sink and mopped the bathroom floor. But not well. They forgot the grout, the mirror, the tiny smear on the stair rail. Mistakes. Arrogance. In their minds, the job was done. By 1:30 a.m., they had reached Dexter Reservoir. No one else was around. The moon hung low, half covered by clouds. They dragged the bodies to the edge of the dam and tied weights to their ankles. Dumbbells, resistance bars, pieces of metal chain. They pushed them in one by one. The water swallowed the truth. But not forever. They came for money. They left with blood. And for less than $300 in cash and a few stolen rings. They murdered an entire family. A father. A mother. 2 children. All silenced in their own home. And by the time the sun rose, the killers were already planning their escape. In the days following the murders, the Carson house sat behind yellow police tape, silent, sealed, and saturated with grief. News of the killings swept through Eugene like wildfire. It was the kind of crime people only saw in headlines from faraway cities, not in their own backyard. But here it was. A family of 4, tortured, killed, and discarded like trash in a lake. The question now wasn't just why. It was who. Within a week, Leo Wang was identified as the man in the surveillance footage. His student visa had been revoked. His dorm was empty. His roommate, Ning Yang, had also vanished. Both had left the country. Border records showed they'd boarded a flight from Seattle to Shanghai just 2 days after the murders. And just like that, they were gone. International. Protected by distance, and by the fact that the U.S. had no formal extradition treaty with China for crimes punishable by death. It was a setback. A devastating one. But not the end. Because Wei Wei was still in the country. Wei had gone quiet. After the murders, he withdrew from what remained of his classes, disconnected his phone, and abandoned his apartment. For 2 months, he floated between cheap motels, sleeping on floors, eating fast food, and hiding in the cracks of a country he barely understood. He didn't reach out to his family. He didn't leave the state. He thought the others would be caught first. He was wrong. On August 3, 2005, at Portland International Airport, Wei Wei was spotted arguing with a cashier at a convenience store inside Terminal B. He was angry about a declined debit card. His voice was raised. Security was alerted. 2 Port Authority officers approached. Wei panicked and ran. He made it less than 40 yards before he was tackled to the ground. In his backpack was a one-way plane ticket to Hong Kong. Departure, 7:15 a.m. Time of arrest, 6:32 a.m. He had been less than an hour away from disappearing forever. At first, Wei Wei said nothing. No confession. No emotion. But when police presented him with forensic reports, DNA matches to semen found on Angela Carson, fingerprints inside the Carson home, and his own skin cells under Angela's fingernails, his silence cracked. He asked one question. Are they dead? When the detective said yes, Wei Wei closed his eyes, breathed slowly, and said, I didn't want to do it. I just wanted out. In a formal confession 2 days later, Wei revealed everything. The planning. The scouting. The night itself. He admitted to being present for every moment of the attack, though he continued to insist he never intended to kill anyone. His statement wasn't enough. Because Angela had been raped. Lucas and Emily had been choked to death. And David had drowned while bound and conscious. The prosecution charged Wei Wei with 4 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of aggravated sexual assault, 1 count of felony kidnapping, 1 count of conspiracy to commit homicide. They sought the death penalty. Meanwhile, Chinese authorities were under mounting diplomatic pressure. International headlines accused them of harboring murderers. U.S. media outlets ran nightly segments on the killers who got away. To everyone's surprise, Chinese law enforcement responded quickly. 2 months after Wei's arrest, a tip came in from a manufacturing plant in Liaoyang, northeast China. A new employee had bragged during a drunken gathering that he'd once killed a whole family in America. His name, Leo Wang. Police arrested him that night. When shown a photo of the Carsons, Leo broke down. He confessed everything and gave up the location of his accomplice, Ning Yang, who had been staying with distant relatives in Guangzhou. By the end of 2005, all 3 suspects were in custody. Now came the question, would justice be served? The Chinese government refused to extradite Leo and Ning back to the United States. But, in a rare cooperative move, they agreed to prosecute them under Chinese law. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. In a closed trial in early 2006, both men stood before a Chinese criminal court. Testimony from Wei Wei, statements from the Eugene police, and forensic reports were all submitted through international cooperation. In the end, Leo Wang was sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole. Ning Yang was sentenced to death and executed by lethal injection within the year. As for Wei Wei, his trial in Oregon began in 2007. The courtroom was packed. Media, families, protesters. A sketch artist captured every expression he made, except he barely made any. His defense argued that he was coerced, that he was a passive participant, that he had no violent history. The jury didn't buy it. He was convicted on all counts and sentenced to death. But in America, death comes slowly. Executions require the approval of the state's attorney general and governor. Oregon's laws at the time placed Way on death row, but with an average wait time of over a decade. So he waited. 1 year. Then 5. Then 10. His family visited, less and less over time. His mother came twice. His sister, 3 times. His father never showed. By 2019, 14 years after the crime, Way was one of the longest-waiting death row inmates in the state. And then, the final signature was signed. In April 2019, at 5:42 a.m., Way was executed by lethal injection. His last words? "I know I don't deserve peace, but if this helps her father sleep, then I accept it." It took 14 years, 3 countries, and 1 surviving grandfather who never stopped pushing. George Carson was present for every day of the trial. He stood quietly as the final verdict was read. He visited the graves of his son, his daughter-in-law, and his grandchildren every Sunday. And when asked by a reporter what justice looked like, he said, "Justice? There's no justice for what they did. There's only truth, and time, and maybe someday peace."